Emily Carter tightened the knot of her scarf as she moved down the aisle of American Eagle Flight 372, her polished shoes clicking against the narrow cabin floor. At 27, she had perfected the art of blending into the background. The cheerful flight attendant passengers noticed but never truly remembered, the invisible hand keeping the cabin moving smoothly. She had been doing this for 6 years, after failing to pass her final flight school check to become a commercial pilot. At the time, she'd been devastated. The simulator didn't forgive nerves, and she had them in spades. Yet here she was, floating at 30,000 feet above the vast expanse of the Midwest, with 146 lives in her care and a meticulously folded smile on her face. She had learned to be invisible but indispensable. Today, she hoped, would be just another uneventful flight. The morning had started like any other. Early wake-up, coffee poured into a travel mug, and the soft hum of the airport in the early hours, punctuated by the rolling of luggage carts and the distant clang of baggage conveyors. Emily slipped into her uniform in the staff locker room, ironed and crisp. She pinned her wings just so, straightened her hair, and glanced at her reflection. This small ritual reminded her that she was professional, capable, even if the world outside didn't see her ambition behind the smile. Boarding began on time. Passengers shuffled past her, some tired and irritable, others giddy with the promise of a weekend getaway. Emily greeted them all with the same warmth, guiding mothers with strollers, offering cheerful nods to businessmen lost in their phones. She noted small details, overstuffed carry-ons, an elderly man who seemed nervous, a teenage boy with earbuds blocking the world. She cataloged everything silently. It was part of her survival instinct. She had learned, over years of navigating cramped aisles and impossible seating arrangements, to anticipate trouble before it happened. Captain Douglas Harris was already seated in the cockpit when Emily approached for her pre-flight greetings. She had flown with him once before, a stern man with deep-set eyes and a quiet authority. Today, though, something in his expression struck her as off. He was staring at the instrument panel, tapping fingers in a nervous rhythm. "Good morning, Captain," Emily said brightly, her voice cutting through his tension. "Morning, Emily," he replied, not looking up. Everything normal today, but there was no conviction in his tone. She noticed the co-pilot too, a younger man with a nervous energy that mirrored her own internal anxiety. His eyes flicked up once, then returned to the paperwork on his kneeboard. Emily forced herself to shake off the unease crawling up her spine. Pilots had quirks. She had quirks. Maybe this was nothing. Takeoff was smooth. The roar of the engines vibrated through the cabin, a comforting constant. Emily moved into her rhythm, securing luggage, checking seatbelts, demonstrating safety procedures, reassuring the nervous passengers with practiced smiles. Halfway through the beverage service, she paused by a window to watch the endless patchwork of farmland stretching below. Sunlight glinted off lakes and rivers like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful and deceptively serene. She returned to the aisle and pushed the cart forward, offering drinks to passengers. Coffee, water, juice. Smiles, nods, murmured thanks. A child waved at her and Emily waved back, heart swelling with a quiet joy she didn't often allow herself. This was why she loved her job, fleeting moments of human connection, small victories in the chaos of the skis. Then at precisely 10,000 meters, something changed. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. The hum of the engines shifted, a slight unevenness in the vibration beneath her feet. She paused, glancing up at the cockpit. The intercom crackled once, a brief distortion of static, then silence. Emily froze. Normally, the captain's voice would announce any cabin adjustments, seatbelt warnings, or altitude changes. Nothing. She tried the intercom again, light tapping of the button, but no response. Passengers shifted in their seats, frowning at her as if she held the answers. A mother clutched her daughter's hand. A man in the exit row muttered a question about turbulence. Emily forced a smile. "Just a brief static issue," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Her hand trembled slightly as she moved down the aisle, checking on passengers. She told herself not to panic. Flight attendants were trained for emergencies, but this was unprecedented. A cockpit that didn't respond, at 10,000 meters, with everyone depending on her. The first wave of real fear came when she knocked on the cockpit door. Knock, knock, Captain Harris, co-pilot, everything okay? No answer. She pressed her ear to the cold metal, heart hammering. The faint rustle of papers, a distant hum of instruments, but no voices. She tried again, louder this time. A sharp tap on the door reverberated through the cabin. Passengers noticed, curiosity and unease rippling through the rows. Emily felt their eyes on her. She swallowed, keeping her voice calm. "Everything's fine, folks. Please stay seated and keep calm." But even as the words left her mouth, her own pulse thudded in her ears. Something was wrong. She tried the internal phone system. Nothing. Then the cockpit radio. Static. Nothing. Her mind raced through the training drills she'd memorized but never expected to use. Locked cockpit door, incapacitated pilots, cabin in chaos. She had read about it, simulated it on paper, but never imagined facing it in real life. The plane jolted suddenly. Coffee sloshed in cups, a tray tipped. Passengers gasped. Emily grabbed the nearest seat, bracing herself as the aircraft wavered slightly in the thin air. The autopilot fought to stabilize it, but she could feel the subtle pull, the mechanical battle raging beyond the cockpit door. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to freeze entirely. She reminded herself, panic helped no one. Not the passengers, not herself, not the pilots, whoever they were. She squared her shoulders and moved forward again, trying the door. Locked. Not just standard lock, jammed, something preventing it from opening. Fear clawed at her, sharp and invasive. She could feel every eye in the cabin on her now. Children sensed it first. A baby began to wail. The mother tried to soothe it, hands shaking. Emily gritted her teeth and pushed the beverage cart aside, moving toward the cockpit like a soldier heading into battle. Every step felt like it weighed a ton. "Please, everyone, remain calm," she said, voice firmer than she felt. She repeated it again, almost as a mantra for herself. "Calm, Emily, calm." She glanced back at the rows of passengers. Each face reflected trust, expectation, fear. A collective reliance she could not abandon. She swallowed hard. She had to do something, anything. She had no idea yet what, but the clock was ticking, altitude was critical, and the silence from the cockpit was deafening. Emily crouched by the door, hand pressed against the cold metal. She could hear the faint hiss of airflow through the ventilation system, the low thrumming of the engines, but the voices of the pilots were gone. And then a small but insidious thought crept in. What if they're not coming back? The thought made her stomach drop. She shook her head violently, trying to expel it. Flight attendants didn't think like that. They managed, guided, reassured. They didn't panic. But now, standing at the threshold of the locked cockpit with 146 souls counting on her, she realized something terrifying. She might have to lead where she had no authority, where she had no right. And as she pounded on the door once more, a chilling realization settled deep in her chest. This was no routine flight. This was no emergency she had trained for. Something had gone terribly, dangerously wrong, and the lives of everyone on board hung in a delicate, invisible balance. Emily stepped back slightly, hands trembling, and looked out across the cabin. Eyes followed hers. Whispers began. The plane's hum was steady but uneasy. Outside the window, the sky stretched infinite and indifferent, a bright blue canvas hiding a threat none of them could see. And then the first sharp jolt of turbulence hit, a warning, a signal, a prelude. Emily's fingers clenched the door handle. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side, but she knew this. She couldn't let fear win. Not here. Not now. Not with 146 lives in her hands. Her eyes met the mother clutching her baby, the businessman gripping the armrest, the teenager frozen with earbuds still in. Emily forced her voice into calm authority, even as her pulse raced and sweat beaded her brow. "Please, everyone, trust me. I'll handle this." The words barely left her lips when a louder, more terrifying jolt shook the plane. Something shifted in the cabin, a terrifying premonition. Emily's stomach lurched. The cockpit door still didn't budge. And in that heartbeat, Emily understood. Everything she had trained for, every skill she had ever thought useless, would be tested in the most unimaginable way possible. The hum of the engines became a growl. The intercom remained dead. The cockpit door remained sealed. And somewhere inside, the pilots remained silent. Emily Carter's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the cockpit door handle for the third time. The metal felt cold, almost mocking in its unyielding resistance. She pounded with her fists, voice raised, calling out over the deafening roar of the engines. "Captain Harris, co-pilot, can anyone hear me?" Nothing. The cabin had grown strangely quiet. Even the murmurs of passengers had dulled to tense whispers. A mother clutched her child closer, rocking gently as if proximity could stave off disaster. A businessman froze mid-sip of coffee, staring at Emily like she held the fate of the universe in her hands, which, in a sense, she did. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Flight attendants weren't supposed to fly the plane. They weren't supposed to deal with catastrophic emergencies at 10,000 meters. They were the calm, invisible hands, the reassurers. But today, everything had changed. Emily knelt briefly to steady herself. Her mind raced, scanning every procedure she had ever been taught in her 6 years of flying. Emergency protocols, evacuation plans, safety drills. She had simulated everything in her mind countless times, yet never like this. Never with the cockpit silent and the lives of 146 people, her responsibility hanging by a thread. She looked back down the aisle. Eyes followed hers, wide with a mixture of trust, fear, and confusion. A man in the exit row whispered to his wife, "What's happening?" Emily forced a smile, pushing down the panic threatening to surge inside her. "Everything is fine," she said, voice stronger than she felt. "Please remain seated. We are handling it." Her own life felt hollow, she knew it. Emily crouched by the door again, pressing her ear to the cold metal. The faint sound of airflow and instruments persisted, but the voices of the pilots remained absent. She tried the intercom system, dead. Then the radio, static. Ground control wasn't answering. Her stomach twisted in fear. Something had gone horribly wrong. She glanced around, trying to assess the situation. Passengers were beginning to murmur nervously. Children clung to parents. The elderly man in row 14 kept adjusting his glasses, muttering to himself. A teenage boy stared blankly at the ceiling, earbuds still in place, oblivious, or trying to be. Emily's mind raced. What could cause both pilots to go silent at once? Fainting, sudden illness, something more sinister. She shook off the thoughts, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs. She had to act. Reaching for the emergency access key was against standard procedure, only used when the captain instructed. But Emily had no choice. Her hand hovered over the compartment where it was stored, hesitating. Could she really do this? The consequences of a wrong move were catastrophic. One mistake and the plane could spiral out of control, killing everyone on board. She swallowed her fear and pulled the key out. Her knuckles whitened as she tried it in the cockpit lock. Jammed. Something prevented the door from opening. Her heart skipped a beat. Panic clawed at her chest. She could feel the pressure of 146 eyes on her, silently begging her to succeed. The plane lurched. A sudden dip sent trays of coffee tumbling to the floor. Passengers gasped, some letting out startled cries. Emily braced herself against the doorframe, her teeth clenched. The autopilot was struggling. She could feel it, subtle but undeniable, a mechanical battle happening beyond the door. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Stay calm." Her gaze scanned the cabin again. One by one she took mental notes, row by row, seat by seat. There were people depending on her, counting on her, and she couldn't fail them. She grabbed the PA microphone, voice trembling only slightly, and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we are experiencing a minor technical issue in the cockpit. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and stay calm. Everything is under control." Her words were meant to reassure, but she knew the passengers sensed the truth. Fear is contagious, and it was spreading like wildfire. Bobbies cried. A woman whispered prayers under her breath. A man gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emily forced herself to breathe, inhaling and exhaling slowly, trying to inject calm into the cabin with every word. A sudden jolt threw her forward. The plane wavered dangerously, a sharp tilt that sent trays clattering. Passengers screamed. Emily's stomach lurched. She grabbed the nearest seat for support, heart pounding. Her mind raced for solutions, for anything that could stabilize the aircraft. The autopilot was struggling. Without the pilots, the plane was a coiled spring, ready to snap. She glanced at the flight attendants in the cabin. Each of them stared at her with wide eyes, waiting for guidance. Emily forced herself to meet their gaze, to exude authority she didn't fully feel. "Follow my lead," she said, voice firm. "We are going to get through this." She returned to the cockpit door, banging on it with renewed desperation. "Open up, anyone in there?" Nothing. Then a new idea struck her, an access panel mentioned by a maintenance engineer months ago near the cockpit floor. It was rarely used, practically forgotten. Emily scanned the floor, eyes landing on a faint outline beneath the console. She grabbed the nearest screwdriver from the galley and pried at the panel, hands trembling. The metal gave way, revealing a small crawl space. Emily's heart pounded. She could feel the altitude pressing against her chest, the pressure of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She crawled through the narrow opening, darkness swallowing her. Inside, the cockpit hatch loomed ahead. Emily pushed against it. Metal resisted. She shifted, twisted, pressed harder, and finally created enough space to peer inside. The sight stole her breath. Captain Harris slumped over the controls, eyes closed, pale. The co-pilot lay twisted across the side console, body limp. Instruments blinked warning lights. The autopilot struggled to maintain stability. Emily's stomach turned. Neither pilot moved. Her mind raced. If they were unconscious, she could perhaps take control, stabilize the plane. But what if they weren't breathing? She pressed her hand to the captain's neck, no pulse. Then the co-pilot, none. A wave of nausea hit her. This wasn't fainting. This wasn't a temporary collapse. Something had incapacitated them completely. A spark of fear surged. Could it be carbon monoxide, oxygen failure, some electrical malfunction? Whatever it was, it had almost claimed the lives of everyone on board. Emily forced herself to focus. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her training, her instincts, her will to survive, they all converged into one singular purpose: keep the plane in the air, keep the passengers alive. She climbed fully into the cockpit, straddling the narrow space with trembling legs. The yoke felt alien in her hands, but she remembered simulator drills, remembered the hours spent memorizing every switch, every gauge, every emergency procedure. A warning bell shrieked. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She pulled the yoke gently, correcting the plane's tilt. The cabin stabilized slightly, though still dangerous. Behind her, the soldier who had been helping her crawled into the cockpit. "You're flying this," he said, jaw tight, eyes wide. "We trust you." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She felt the weight of the lives in her hands more acutely than she ever had before. 146 souls, counting on a woman who had once failed her pilot exams, now responsible for steering a massive aircraft through thin air with no instruction manual. The radio crackled faintly. Emily grabbed the microphone, voice quivering. "Mayday, Flight 372, pilots down, flight attendant controlling aircraft." Static, then a voice. We hear you. Maintain current heading. You can do this." Emily drew a shaky breath. The words were fragile lifelines in the chaos. She adjusted the yoke slightly, scanning instruments, scanning the horizon, scanning every gauge. Altitude, speed, fuel levels, all vital, all unforgiving. A sudden sharp drop made her stomach lurch. The cabin lights flickered. She gritted her teeth, bracing herself. This was no longer a simulation. This was life, death, terror, and hope all tangled together at 10,000 meters. Emily Carter, flight attendant, invisible helper, had become the unlikely guardian of 146 souls. And she was only just beginning to realize the true magnitude of what lay ahead. Outside, the world stretched endless and indifferent, a stark reminder that at this altitude mistakes were fatal and time was running out. The cabin was thick with tension. Every passenger seemed to sense the danger now, though no one yet knew its full extent. A low murmur of whispers ran through the rows, punctuated by the occasional cry of a child. Emily moved as if through molasses, her steps deliberate, her mind a whirlwind of fear and calculated decisions. She tried the cockpit door again, fists slamming against the metal. Nothing. The lock held firm. Panic pressed at the edges of her mind, a dark, insistent presence threatening to break her. This cannot happen. Not on my watch. Her eyes scanned the cabin. Passengers were trembling, clinging to the familiar. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath. Mothers rocked bobbies, whispering reassurances they didn't feel. A businessman clenched his jaw so hard his face turned pale, sweat forming at his temples. Emily had trained for turbulence, for minor emergencies, but this was uncharted territory. She grabbed the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The crew is handling a minor technical issue," she said, voice steadier than she felt. A tremor of disbelief ran through the passengers. Some believed her, others didn't. Fear was a contagion, and it spread faster than any virus. Emily forced herself to breathe. She ran scenarios in her mind: cockpit incapacitated, autopilot malfunctioning, altitude dropping. The knowledge she had gained in flight school, though incomplete, became her lifeline. She remembered simulator hours, emergency drills, the instructor's words echoing: "Stay calm. Assess. Act." She scanned the aisle again. Her colleagues, equally terrified, looked to her for guidance. Emily nodded to each of them, trying to transmit calm. "Follow my lead," she said. "We're going to get through this." The plane shuddered violently. Coffee spilled across the aisle, passengers screamed, seat trays toppled. Emily stumbled, bracing herself against the galley. Her stomach lurched. This wasn't turbulence. The autopilot was struggling, fighting against forces she could not see. She turned back to the cockpit door. She had tried every conventional method: intercom, radio, knocking, the emergency key. All failed. Her hands trembled as she realized the next step would require force and ingenuity. Her memory flashed to a conversation with a maintenance engineer 6 months earlier. There was an access panel, rarely used, near the floor of the cockpit. Emily's pulse quickened. It was a long shot, but it was her only shot. She grabbed a screwdriver from the galley. Her hands were slippery with sweat, and the metal handle felt alien in her grip. She knelt, prying at the faint outline of the panel. With a groan of effort, the thin metal gave way. A small crawl space yawned open before her, dark and narrow, swallowing the light. Emily glanced back at the passengers, who watched with a mix of hope and terror. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remember every drill, every lesson, every second of flight school. She was not trained for this, but she could adapt. She had to. Crawling through the panel, the cabin noise faded slightly, replaced by the hum of instruments and the pressurized atmosphere of the cockpit bay. Her mind raced. She had to reach the pilots. She had to assess. She had to act. Finally, she reached the inner cockpit hatch. She pushed with all her strength, metal resisting. Her heart hammered in her chest, every beat a drum of terror and resolve. With a final heave, the door shifted just enough for her to see inside. The sight stole her breath. Captain Harris slumped over the controls, head tilted unnaturally to the side. The co-pilot lay sprawled across the console, eyes closed, pale and unmoving. The red warning lights blinked in ominous rhythm. The autopilot struggled to maintain stability, but the plane was already tilting dangerously. Emily's stomach churned. Neither pilot was moving, no breathing, no pulse. She pressed a trembling hand to the captain's neck. Nothing. Then the co-pilot, nothing. Her mind raced, a torrent of questions and instructions. Carbon monoxide, oxygen failure, electrical malfunction. Whatever it was, it had incapacitated them both, leaving the aircraft in a precarious, deadly state. A sharp jolt rocked the plane, snapping Emily back to reality. Coffee spilled onto her uniform. The warning alarm screeched, piercing her skull. She swallowed the rising tide of panic and focused on what she could control. The plane was descending slightly, autopilot fighting a losing battle. She had to stabilize it, at least temporarily, until she could call for help. Her eyes scanned the cockpit, instruments flashing, controls unfamiliar yet familiar enough from simulators. She remembered the hours in the training seat, the pressure of a fake emergency. Now it was real, and the lives of 146 people depended on her ability to act under pressure. Emily slid into the captain's seat, knees shaking. The yoke felt alien in her hands, but she gripped it firmly, forcing her mind into clarity. She had to trust her instincts, trust the training that had seemed useless before. Every lever, button, and gauge became a lifeline. Behind her, the soldier who had helped her into the cockpit crouched, wide-eyed but silent. "You're flying this," he said. "We trust you." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. The weight of responsibility was almost unbearable. She adjusted the yoke slightly, leveling the aircraft enough to reduce the tilt. The alarms shrieked in protest, but the plane stabilized marginally. Her mind flicked to the radio, ground control, emergency frequencies, anything. She grabbed the handset, voice shaking, and spoke into the static. "Mayday, Flight 372, pilots down, flight attendant controlling aircraft." Static. Then finally a voice. "We hear you, maintain heading, you can do this." Relief flooded through her in brief waves, but she had no time to celebrate. The autopilot had failed partially, the plane wavered, and altitude readings showed a slow but dangerous descent. Emily adjusted the controls, focusing intently on every indicator, every gauge, every subtle movement. Passengers sensed the tension, the extraordinary stakes. Whispers of prayers, stifled cries, and wide-eyed disbelief filled the cabin. Emily spoke calmly into the microphone. "Remain calm, everyone. We are stabilizing the aircraft. Help is on the way." A sudden sharp dip sent her stomach into her throat. She gritted her teeth, holding the yoke tightly. The soldier behind her whispered, "You're doing great." Emily didn't respond. Words felt useless. Action mattered. Survival mattered. The autopilot, now partially disengaged, lurched. Instruments blinked warnings of fuel imbalance, angle of attack, and altitude deviation. Emily fought to keep the plane level, using every ounce of knowledge she had. Sweat streamed down her face, fingers numb, yet she refused to let go. The cabin behind her was eerily quiet, tension coiling in the air like a living thing. Every passenger watched, every breath caught in collective anticipation. Emily felt a singular focus sharpen her mind. She could not fail. She would not fail. She scanned the controls for communication options, emergency procedures, alternative routes. A small spark of hope. The access panel she had crawled through offered enough clearance to manipulate minor systems. She could reroute power, override the autopilot slightly, and stabilize the descent. Her hands moved with purpose now, guided by instinct, training, and raw determination. Every adjustment was precise. Every correction was deliberate. The plane responded just enough to reduce the tilt, reduce the descent rate by precious minutes. Emily's heart pounded. She dared not think of the alternative. Not yet. Survival depended on focus, on action, on her unwillingness to let fear dominate. The first passengers had begun murmuring words of encouragement, a quiet, trembling cheer. Emily barely heard them over the alarms, but their trust steeled her resolve. She would not let them down. And even as she manipulated the controls, adjusting flaps and monitoring altitude, a dark thought lingered. The pilots are gone. If I fail now, no one survives. Emily forced herself to ignore it. She had no choice. Failure was not an option. She was no longer a flight attendant in the eyes of fate. She was the pilot, the protector, the improbable savior of 146 souls. Above her, the sky stretched infinite, indifferent. Below, the landscape of the Midwest seemed peaceful and naive. Neither knew the storm inside Flight 372, neither aware that survival depended entirely on one woman's courage and determination. Emily tightened her grip on the yoke. She adjusted the throttle, scanned the instruments, and whispered to herself, "We're going to make it. We have to make it." And outside the cockpit, the first signs of turbulence hinted at the next challenge, the descent, the unknown variables, the peril she would face next. Every second counted. Every movement mattered. One mistake could mean catastrophe. Emily Carter, flight attendant turned reluctant hero, was now fully immersed in the unthinkable. The fight for Flight 372 had truly begun. Emily Carter's hands ached from holding the yoke, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. Every instrument in the cockpit was a screaming testament to danger. Altitude dropping, airspeed fluctuating, fuel warnings blinking red like taunting eyes. She took a deep, trembling breath, forcing her mind into a zone of focus she hadn't known existed. The soldier behind her, Private First Class Marcus Daniels, kept watch on the cabin. His voice was low but steady. "You've got this. Just follow what you know." Emily nodded without looking. Every ounce of her training, every simulator hour, every observation she had ever made in a cockpit now mattered. Failure was not an option. "Emily," Marcus whispered, voice barely audible over alarms, "passengers are getting anxious." She turned slightly, just enough to catch their faces through the small cockpit window. Their eyes were wide with a mix of fear, awe, and helpless reliance. Mothers clutched children. Elderly passengers prayed under their breaths. Businessmen who had been glued to laptops and phones now stared at the back of her head like she held the power of life and death. Emily swallowed hard and pressed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a technical difficulty, but your crew is managing it. Trust me, help is on the way." The cabin was tense but responsive. Emily could hear passengers whispering prayers, a faint murmuring that threaded hope and fear together. She felt the responsibility pressing down harder than gravity ever could. The plane lurched. She held the yoke tight, muscles trembling. Keep it level, keep it steady. Each movement, each adjustment was deliberate. Her mind replayed every lesson, every drill, every critical scenario she had been taught. A sudden thought struck her. She needed to assess why the autopilot had failed. She glanced at the console, noticing an unusual reading in the primary flight computer, some kind of electrical surge or misfire. She didn't fully understand it, but instinct told her that minor manual adjustments could keep the aircraft stable. She adjusted the throttle slightly, leveling the wings. Alarms shrieked in protest, but the plane steadied. The cabin jolted, passengers gasping, clinging to seats, gripping each other. Emily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. Marcus leaned closer. "Emily, there's something you should see." He handed her a headset. She slipped it on, connecting to the emergency frequency she had been using. "Flight 372, a voice crackled. "Maintain heading. We have emergency crews on standby. You can land this aircraft." Relief surged through her, though it was tempered by terror. Land the aircraft. The thought of approaching the runway, aligning, controlling, landing. She had read about it, simulated it, but never done it in real life. And yet here it was, 146 people counting on her. She tightened her grip on the yoke. "We can do this," she whispered, mostly to herself. Marcus stayed close, watching the cabin through the small window. Emily had an idea. She could organize the passengers, give them specific instructions to maintain calm. Every hand, every mind, every ounce of focus mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began over the PA, voice firm, controlled, "we are working to stabilize the aircraft. I need you to stay calm, remain seated, and follow the crew's instructions. If everyone cooperates, we can get through this safely." A hush fell over the cabin. The tension remained, but her calm voice created a fragile thread of hope. Passengers obeyed, fastening seatbelts, securing belongings, bracing for turbulence. Emily caught their eyes where she could, transmitting silent reassurance. The plane jolted again. Emily's stomach lurched. The instruments blinked warnings: angle of attack, fuel imbalance, altitude. She adjusted the yoke, leaning her weight, coaxing the plane into stability. Sweat poured down her face, trickling into her eyes, but she didn't blink, didn't let fear dominate. Marcus whispered again, "We need to figure out the cockpit door. If you can get in fully and access the controls, we might have more leverage on autopilot." Emily's stomach dropped. She had already pried the access panel open and crawled halfway through. She now realized she needed to climb fully into the captain's seat to manipulate all controls directly. The plane was unstable, altitude dropping. Every second mattered. "Marcus," she said, voice firm despite terror gnawing inside her, "I need you to stay here and monitor the passengers. Keep them calm. Guide them. I can't do this and manage the cabin simultaneously." He nodded, jaw tight, and retreated slightly, eyes never leaving the cabin. Emily adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke to correct a slight bank, and began maneuvering herself fully into the captain's seat. The cockpit was tight, claustrophobic. Every movement required careful calculation. Her legs twisted, arms extended. Instruments blinked warnings. The plane shuddered, but finally she settled into position, yoke within reach, throttle accessible. She exhaled sharply, one step closer to control, but still no guarantee of survival. Emily scanned the instruments again. Airspeed, altitude, vertical speed, heading. The autopilot's failure had left subtle oscillations, almost imperceptible but deadly. She made minute corrections, coaxing the aircraft into a temporary glide path. Each adjustment demanded precision, concentration, and nerves of steel. Suddenly, a sharp tilt to the left, banking too aggressively. Passengers gasped. Emily's stomach lurched. She countered with a delicate tug on the yoke. The plane righted. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, but she didn't allow herself to pause. Every second counted. "Emily," Marcus whispered again, voice strained. "The passengers, they're looking at you. They need reassurance. Make them believe we can survive this." Emily drew a deep breath, forced her voice steady, and addressed the cabin. "Everyone, listen carefully. We are managing the aircraft. I need you to stay calm, stay in your seats, and brace yourselves for turbulence. Keep your seatbelts fastened. Follow instructions. We are going to get through this together." A mother clutched her baby tightly, tears streaming down her face. A businessman nodded, swallowing hard. Passengers began adjusting straps, securing belongings. The cabin buzzed with tense cooperation. Emily felt a thread of hope. It was fragile, but it existed. The plane jolted again, a sharp shudder down the fuselage. Emily's hands trembled slightly on the yoke, muscles screaming in protest, but she forced herself to remain steady. Steady. Focus. Control. Her mind flicked to the landing. She had to assess the terrain, the nearest airport, the runway. Emergency procedures for a controlled landing. Flight school lessons, most of them theoretical, some simulated. Now reality. She would have to navigate, align, descend, and land. And every mistake could cost 146 lives. She reached for the radio, voice steady despite pounding adrenaline. "Mayday! Flight 372. Pilots incapacitated. Flight attendant in control. Request emergency landing instructions. Static, then a calm voice. Flight 372, we have you. Maintain heading and altitude. Emergency cruise standing by. Guidance incoming for approach. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. One piece of the puzzle aligned, but the plane still required constant adjustment. She adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, monitored instruments. Every movement was deliberate, every decision critical. The plane jolted again, turbulence rattling the cabin. Emily's stomach flipped. She adjusted again, fingers clenching, muscles screaming, adrenaline coursing like molten fire. She could do this. She had to. Marcus leaned close. Emily, the passengers are looking to you as their leader. They need hope. You need to give it to them. Emily exhaled, voice calm, eyes scanning instruments, cabin, sky. We are going to make it, she said firmly. Stay seated. Brace yourselves. Help is coming. The cabin shifted slightly, passengers adjusting. Some whispered prayers. Others clutched hands across aisles. A fragile, tense trust formed, connecting them all. Emily felt it too. It strengthened her resolve. The plane shuddered, tilting slightly again. Emily held the yoke, adjusted the controls, coaxed the aircraft into a temporary balance. The autopilot struggled, but for now, she had bought them precious seconds. Seconds that could mean life. Seconds that could mean survival. Seconds that would determine the outcome of Flight 372. And as she sat in the captain's seat, trembling, sweating, yet resolute, Emily Carter understood the reality of what she had become. No longer just a flight attendant. She was the pilot. She was the guardian. And the battle for 146 lives had only just begun. Emily Carter's hands were shaking, muscles screaming, but she forced herself to stay focused. The cockpit lights blinked warnings in a relentless rhythm. Altitude dropping, fuel warning lights flashing, autopilot failure alarm shrieking. Every instrument seemed to taunt her with the consequences of even the smallest mistake. She glanced back at Marcus, who crouched silently, eyes darting between her and the cabin behind them. We can't stay here forever, he whispered. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. The passengers' trust was her lifeline. She couldn't let them see the panic clawing inside her. The thought of what she might find behind the pilots pressed heavily in her mind. Carbon monoxide leak, oxygen failure, some sudden, deadly illness. She had no answers, only an access panel she had already partially pried open. This was it, the next step. If she didn't investigate fully, she had no hope of stabilizing the aircraft. Emily knelt on the floor, fingers bleeding from prying at the metal. The panel shifted slightly. She forced herself to crawl through, tight quarters pressing against her chest. Darkness enveloped her as she wriggled toward the cockpit hatch. Every movement required careful calculation. The plane lurched beneath her, tossing her body slightly against the narrow walls. Finally, she reached the hatch and pushed against it with all her strength. Metal groaned but yielded just enough to allow her to peer inside. Her stomach dropped at the sight. Captain Harris lay slumped over the controls, head tilted unnaturally. The co-pilot sprawled across the console, eyes closed, pale. Instruments blinked red warnings, autopilot struggling, the plane tilting slightly as if testing the limits of her resolve. Emily's heart pounded in her ears. She pressed her hand to the captain's neck, no pulse, then the co-pilot, none. Her mind raced. Neither was unconscious, neither was merely incapacitated, both were gone, dead. The realization hit her like a freight train. Every scenario she had mentally rehearsed, every emergency drill, every survival simulation, none prepared her for this. 2 pilots dead at 10,000 meters, a plane hurtling through the air with 146 lives depending entirely on her. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Nausea threatened to overtake her, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had to act, now. Emily shifted fully into the captain's seat, bracing herself. Her hands gripped the yoke, fingers trembling as she aligned it carefully. The plane tilted slightly left. She corrected with a subtle tug. Alarms screamed, warning lights flashed, but the aircraft responded. She allowed herself a fraction of hope. She could do this. Behind her, Marcus remained close, scanning the cabin. "Emily, I don't even know what to do," he admitted. "Just do whatever you think is right." Her jaw tightened. There was no room for doubt. She adjusted the throttle slightly, coaxing the plane into a more stable glide path. Instruments flickered, altimeter readings fluctuated dangerously, but she maintained control. Every second mattered. Every decision mattered. Emily's mind flicked to the passengers. She needed them calm, obedient, focused. One mistake in panic could be deadly. She reached for the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice firm, controlled despite the adrenaline surging through her veins, "we have experienced an emergency. The pilots are unable to continue, and I am taking command of the aircraft. I need everyone to remain calm, remain seated, and follow instructions carefully. Your cooperation is vital. Together, we can get through this." A hush fell over the cabin. She heard whispered prayers, shuffling of hands securing seatbelts, anxious murmurs of understanding. The fragile thread of trust held. Emily exhaled sharply, eyes scanning the cockpit. She had a limited window. Manual adjustments were necessary to stabilize the plane. She nudged the yoke slightly, tilted the wings, adjusted the throttle. The plane responded, albeit slowly. The autopilot remained partially engaged but erratic. She had to compensate continuously. Marcus leaned close. "What about communications? Can you contact the tower?" She had already tried, but now she grasped the emergency handset again. Voice shaking, she transmitted the dire situation. "Mayday, Flight 372, both pilots dead. Flight attendant controlling aircraft. Request immediate emergency landing instructions." Static. Then a calm voice emerged. "Flight 372, we hear you. Maintain heading. Emergency crews are on standby. Guidance incoming for approach." Relief surged, tempered by terror. Landing. She would have to bring the aircraft down safely, aligning perfectly with the runway, managing speed, altitude, and turbulence, all while knowing any error could be catastrophic. Emily adjusted controls, coaxing the plane into a semi-level glide path. The cabin shook gently with turbulence, passengers gripping armrests, holding breath. She allowed herself one mental acknowledgement: she could stabilize the aircraft. The cockpit offered no room for error. Every switch, every lever, every dial demanded careful observation. She nudged the throttle, adjusted flaps, monitored vertical speed, scanning for any signs of instability. The plane responded gradually, though not perfectly. Her mind raced through the flight school drills she had failed before. Now, failure was not an option. She manipulated controls, checked instruments, rechecked altimeter readings. The plane responded. A small victory, but monumental. Marcus watched her, silent but alert. "Emily, we need to consider landing. You can't keep the plane aloft indefinitely." Her stomach lurched at the thought. Landing was another challenge entirely. The approach, the alignment, the speed, the runway, all hazards she had never faced in real life. But she forced herself to focus. There was no alternative. 146 lives depended on her. Emily turned her attention outward. Through the cockpit windows, the sky stretched endless and indifferent, a harsh blue. Below, the patchwork of farmland and rivers spread like a beautiful, naive canvas, unaware of the struggle above. The contrast sharpened her resolve. Failure was not an option. She adjusted the yoke, coaxed the plane into minor corrections, scanning instruments continuously. Each movement demanded precision, timing, and nerves she wasn't sure she possessed. She was improvising constantly, drawing on fragmented knowledge from flight school, memory, and sheer instinct. A sudden turbulence hit, jostling the plane sharply. Passengers screamed. Emily's stomach lurched violently. She gritted her teeth, adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke. The plane leveled but barely. She had bought precious seconds, seconds that might be the difference between life and death. Her mind flicked back to the pilots, both dead, no breathing. The full weight of the situation pressed down. Every decision she made now mattered exponentially. She had to keep calm. She had to survive. The PA crackled. Flight 372, we have guidance for landing. Follow our instructions carefully. Emergency crews are ready. Emily exhaled sharply. The next phase begins. She adjusted her seat, focused on instruments, prepared mentally for the descent. Every passenger, every crew member, every life depended on her next movements. She swallowed hard, whispering to herself, "We're going to make it. We have to make it." And outside, the sky remained indifferent, unaware that in its vast, infinite expanse, one woman was fighting against fate itself. Emily Carter's hands ached, fingers white from gripping the yoke, arms trembling as she monitored every dial and gauge. The cockpit lights blinked insistently, screaming warnings, but she refused to glance away. At 10,000 meters, with 146 lives depending on her, there was no room for error. "Marcus," she whispered, voice taut, "I'm initiating descent. You need to stay alert and manage the passengers. They have to remain calm." He nodded, jaw tight, eyes scanning the cabin. "I've got them. Don't worry about anything back here." Emily exhaled slowly, trying to steady her pulse. The emergency landing instructions were clear. Maintain heading, reduce altitude gradually, align with the runway. Sounds simple on paper, but in reality, the plane lurched and swayed with turbulence, every minor correction a test of nerves and precision. She eased the throttle, watching the vertical speed indicator. The plane began its descent, engines roaring steadily. Passengers murmured, gripping armrests, whispering prayers. A child cried softly, but Emily forced her mind to focus entirely on the cockpit. "Steady, smooth, steady," she muttered to herself, almost like a mantra. The autopilot had failed partially. Every second, every adjustment required her full attention. She monitored airspeed, flaps, engine thrust. The plane dipped slightly, jolting her stomach, and she corrected with subtle, deliberate nudges of the yoke. Her mind raced ahead. Approach angle, speed, wind gusts, runway alignment, every detail mattered. One miscalculation could send them spiraling into catastrophe. Through the cockpit window, the Midwest stretched endless below, farmland and rivers shimmering innocently. She could almost imagine a world untouched by the terror inside the cabin, but no fantasy could distract her now. Reality demanded perfection. Marcus's voice crackled softly behind her. "Emily, turbulence ahead. Brace for a sharp dip." The plane jolted violently, pitching downward. Emily's stomach lurched, but she held firm, adjusting the yoke to counter the tilt. Red warning lights flashed again, alerting her to minor stall conditions. Sweat poured down her face, dripping into her eyes, but she refused to blink. She could not afford it. "Brace," she whispered into the intercom. "Everyone brace for turbulence. Stay seated, seatbelts fastened." The cabin lurched. Passengers gasped, some gripping the armrests, others holding each other tightly. Emily heard a whispered prayer from the elderly man in row 14. She forced her mind back to the controls. Focus, control, survival. Her eyes flicked to the radio. "Flight 372, she spoke, voice steady despite the adrenaline, descending at 1,500 feet per minute, requesting final approach guidance. Static, then the voice of a calm air traffic controller. "Flight 372, maintain heading. Reduce speed to 200 knots. Align with runway 27L, emergency crews ready. You can do this." Emily exhaled sharply. The next phase, the approach, would be the most dangerous. She adjusted the throttle, nudging the yoke, coaxing the plane into a gentle glide. Every movement was precise, deliberate, the culmination of instinct and fragmentary training. Her mind flicked to landing procedures, flaps, gear, speed management, runway alignment. She recalled the simulator drills she had failed years ago. Every mistake burned into memory. Now mistakes were fatal. She forced herself to translate memory into action. The plane shuddered again. Gusts of wind buffeted the wings, rattling the fuselage. Passengers screamed softly, some clutching each other, some gripping armrests. Emily's knuckles whitened. She adjusted the yoke to compensate, throttle responding sluggishly but adequately. Marcus leaned over, voice low. "Emily, runway's in sight." She peered through the windshield, scanning the approaching tarmac. Emergency lights flashed in the distance, a fragile beacon of hope. She could see the fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue crews lining the runway. It was both reassuring and terrifying. Everything depended on her precision. "Keep calm," she whispered to herself. "Focus, you can do this." She began deploying the flaps, slowing the aircraft to optimal landing speed. The plane groaned under the strain, red warning lights blinking urgently. Emily adjusted the yoke, coaxing the nose level, monitoring descent rate. 20 knots too fast," she muttered under her breath. "Steady, steady." The turbulence intensified. The fuselage shuddered violently. Passengers screamed. Emily could feel the aircraft resisting her every move, but she pressed on, calculating each adjustment, anticipating every gust. Her mind raced through landing sequences. Gear down, flaps full, throttle control, alignment with runway centerline. Every action required timing and precision she had never performed in real life. She swallowed the rising fear. The plane dipped suddenly, forcing her to pull back slightly on the yoke to maintain altitude. Warning alarms blared, red lights flashing. Sweat poured down her temples. Her arms shook. But the runway remained in sight. She adjusted gradually, coaxing the aircraft into alignment. "Marcus," she said, voice firm, "guide the passengers, make sure they're braced. We're about to touch down." He nodded, moving quickly through the cockpit to check straps, reassure passengers, maintain calm. Emily could feel their trust as a tangible weight pressing on her shoulders, strengthening her resolve. She focused on the instruments, correcting small deviations in heading and altitude. The plane responded, sluggish but responsive. She could see the runway lights growing closer, the emergency crews ready to respond. Every second mattered. The plane hit a minor crosswind. Emily adjusted subtly, nudging the yoke, throttle, and flaps. The aircraft shuddered but held its trajectory. She whispered instructions to herself like a mantra: flaps, gear, speed, alignment, calm, precision. Below, the ground rushed toward them. She could see the grass alongside the runway, the tarmac gleaming in the fading sunlight. Emergency vehicles flanked the strip, ready for the worst. Emily felt her heart pounding, adrenaline surging. She began deploying landing gear, listening for confirmation clicks. The plane groaned under the shift, red lights flashing but instruments indicating stability. She eased the throttle, reducing speed carefully. "Approach stable," she muttered. "Flaps full, gear down, align steady." The plane jolted again with turbulence. Passengers gasped. Emily gritted her teeth, fingers white on the yoke. She nudged the nose up slightly, coaxing alignment. Instruments blinked warnings, but she ignored them, trusting instincts and partial knowledge. Hold it," she whispered. "We're almost there." The runway grew closer, massive and immovable in the approaching descent. Emergency crews, silhouetted against the bright lights, were ready. The fate of 146 souls rested entirely on her next moves. The plane lurched violently, threatening to veer off course. Emily fought with every ounce of strength, correcting, adjusting, coaxing the aircraft into line. Red warning lights flared, alarms shrieked, and sweat poured into her eyes. "Almost there," she muttered, voice trembling. "Stay calm, steady." The nose dipped perfectly. The wheels touched the runway, scraping against asphalt with a jolt that made Emily's heart leap. The plane shuddered, tires screeching, flaps resisting. Emergency crews flanked the strip. Every life on board depended on the next seconds of control. Emily eased back on the yoke, coaxing the plane forward. Brakes engaged gradually. The fuselage groaned. The runway stretched on ahead. Passengers gasped, clinging to seats, holding breath collectively. She guided the plane to a slow stop. Engines roared, tires squealing slightly, but finally, Flight 372 came to a complete halt. Silence settled briefly, broken only by the faint hum of instruments. Emily exhaled shakily. Marcus let out a long breath. "You did it," he whispered. Emily's knees buckled slightly, hands still trembling on the yoke. She glanced back at the cabin. Faces stared at her, wide-eyed with disbelief, tears streaming. She realized then the full weight of what she had done. 146 lives saved by a woman who had once been considered just a flight attendant. The cockpit remained still. The emergency crews approached cautiously, and Emily Carter, exhausted, terrified, triumphant, knew the ordeal was not yet fully over. Because in the aftermath of survival, the truth always demanded its reckoning. The plane had come to a halt, but silence did not bring relief. It was a fragile, suspended calm. Emily Carter slumped forward, hands still trembling on the yoke, heart pounding like a drum. The roar of engines fading into idle felt surreal after the chaos of the past hour. She looked around, seeing passengers frozen in disbelief, gripping each other, tears streaming, eyes wide. Marcus leaned over, voice low but steady. "You saved them, Emily, every single one of them." She swallowed hard, letting the words sink in. Saved them. The reality was staggering. One wrong move, one misjudgment, and Flight 372 could have become a headline of horror. Yet here they were, alive, terrified but alive. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft now, walking carefully toward the doors, flashing lights illuminating the fuselage. The calm coordination of professionals contrasted sharply with the raw chaos Emily had endured. She had done it. She had kept control, kept everyone alive, but the weight of what had happened was only beginning to press down on her. "Passengers, please remain seated," one of the first responders instructed firmly, though gentle eyes scanned the cabin for distress. "We will assist you in exiting safely." Emily exhaled shakily and stood, legs trembling under her. The adrenaline surge had kept her upright during the landing, but now exhaustion settled in like a physical weight. She took a tentative step toward the cabin, scanning faces. Mothers clutched children, silently sobbing. Teenagers hugged parents. Elderly passengers shook, trembling from relief, fear, and sheer disbelief. A little girl in row 6 stared at Emily with wide, awe-filled eyes. She whispered, You saved us." Emily's throat tightened. She nodded, forcing a small, shaky smile. "We all did it together," she said, voice trembling but steady. She could feel the emotions inside the cabin, a mixture of gratitude, shock, and profound relief. The responsibility she had carried for 146 lives had not yet fully released its grip. The emergency crew began assisting passengers down the steps. Emily followed slowly, Marcus at her side, ensuring no one panicked. Outside, the cool evening air struck her like a revelation. The smell of jet fuel and fresh tarmac, the hum of emergency vehicles, the flash of lights. It was a world unchanged, yet entirely different for those who had been trapped in the sky. News crews had begun to gather at a distance, sensing something extraordinary. Phones were already capturing shaky videos. The story was spreading even before Emily had left the plane. She felt the pull of attention, but her focus remained on the passengers, ensuring everyone disembarked safely. A young mother approached her, tears streaming, baby still cradled in arms. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. You saved my family." Emily swallowed, forcing composure. "Everyone did their part," she whispered. But inside she knew it was her hands on the yoke, her decisions in the cockpit, that had made the difference. The realization of the pilot's death struck her anew. She had been the only thing between the passengers and catastrophe. Captain Harris, the co-pilot, both gone. She had stepped into a role she had never anticipated, guided only by instinct, fragmented training, and a will to survive. The emergency crew moved the bodies of the pilots carefully. Emily turned away, stomach churning. There would be time to process the horror later, after the passengers were safe. For now, the focus was life, survival, calm. The last passenger stepped off the plane. Emily took a deep breath, letting the tension seep out slowly. Tears she hadn't realized were holding back spilled down her cheeks. Marcus put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did it. You kept them alive. That's all that matters right now." Emily nodded, but her mind raced ahead. Questions would come. How did this happen? Could the pilots have been saved? Was it a mechanical failure, something sinister, or just an unimaginable coincidence? The answers didn't matter yet. What mattered was the lives she had saved. News cameras caught sight of her as she stepped away from the plane, uniform disheveled, face streaked with sweat and tears. They whispered urgently into microphones. Emily didn't answer. Words would fail to capture what had happened, and she wasn't ready for the attention. The story was bigger than her, bigger than the headlines. It was about survival, courage, and the unimaginable circumstances that had forced her to become a hero. An elderly man, walking past the emergency vehicles with assistants, stopped and looked at her. "Young lady, you are a miracle." Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to say something profound, but all she managed was a nod. Her voice caught. "I just did my job," she whispered. Yet even she knew it had been far more than that. Emergency personnel began to usher the crew and passengers into waiting buses. Emily lingered briefly near the plane, eyes scanning the cockpit. The empty seats, the flashing instruments, the silence, it all felt surreal. Hours ago, this had been a death trap in the sky. Now it was a stage for courage, a monument to human determination. Marcus stayed by her side. "You know the story, going to get out," he said quietly. "They'll call you a hero, a miracle worker, but you just kept your head and did what had to be done." Emily nodded slowly, letting herself feel the exhaustion she had fought against for so long. Every muscle ached, every nerve vibrated with residual tension. She had saved lives, but the toll, emotional, physical, psychological, was only beginning to register. The first responders approached, offering assistance. They guided her away from the aircraft, ensuring she remained steady. She allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, inhaling the evening air, the distant smell of smoke from emergency vehicles, the collective sigh of relief from hundreds of souls. A young flight attendant approached, eyes wide. "Emily, I've never seen anything like it. You saved us all." Emily forced a smile, the first genuine one since the ordeal began. "We survived. That's what matters." As she was guided toward a waiting ambulance for observation and medical check, her mind replayed the flight in fragments. The silence of the cockpit, the groaning of the plane, the terrified faces, the tug of the yoke, the delicate adjustments, the miraculous landing. She had stared death in the face at 10,000 meters. She had emerged not just alive, but triumphant in a way she had never imagined. But the knowledge that the pilots, Captain Harris and the co-pilot, were gone pressed heavily on her. They had been her mentors, colleagues, her guides in the sky. Their absence was a void she could not yet comprehend. Outside, news cameras focused, helicopters hovering overhead. Emily felt the gaze of the world pressing down, yet she remained calm, focusing on the immediate, checking on passengers, assisting where she could. One step at a time. Life, safety, survival. The first few passengers were escorted to waiting ambulances. Mothers clutched children, elderly passengers offered shaky thanks. Emily's own tears fell silently as she helped guide them. The reality of the lives she had preserved, 146 souls, settled in. A young boy tugged at her sleeve wide-eyed. "Are we really safe?" Emily knelt down, forcing calm into her voice. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're safe now, you're all safe." The boy nodded, clutching his mother's hand. Emily let herself breathe. for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She glanced back at Flight 372, massive and still on the tarmac, instruments silent, engines idle. It had been a vessel of terror and courage, now a monument to the incredible lengths humans could go to survive. Marcus whispered again, "Emily, people will remember this. You're going to be famous, heroic, but it's okay if you just want to disappear for a while." Emily nodded slowly. Fame was irrelevant. She didn't need accolades. What mattered was that 146 lives were safe, that she had risen to a challenge no one could have predicted, that she had acted when it mattered most. And even as emergency crews swarmed, flashing lights casting long shadows across the runway, Emily Carter realized something profound. Courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite fear, taking command when everything else falls silent, and refusing to surrender when lives hang in the balance. For Flight 372, that courage had come in the form of a young flight attendant who had become so much more than her title. The world would hear about her, but for now she simply exhaled, heart heavy, mind racing, eyes scanning the horizon. She had survived and she had saved 146 others, and that was enough. The sun was setting over the tarmac, casting long, golden shadows across Flight 372. Emily Carter stood near the steps, still in her disheveled uniform, sweat and tears streaked across her face. She had survived the unimaginable, landed a plane at 10,000 meters with 2 pilots dead, and saved 146 lives. And yet, in this quiet moment, she felt none of the triumph others might expect, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Marcus Daniel stood beside her, his usual stoicism softened by relief. "Emily, people will talk about this for years. You didn't just save a flight, you saved history." Emily shook her head slightly. "I just did what I had to do, that's all." Her voice was hoarse from adrenaline and tension, but there was a quiet pride beneath the exhaustion. She had stared death in the face and prevailed, but humility anchored her even in victory. News crews had begun to swarm cautiously, capturing footage, preparing microphones, and trying to get a word from the woman who had taken command when the world expected her to follow. Emily avoided their gaze, focusing instead on the passengers, ensuring every family member, every child, every elderly passenger was accounted for. A little boy ran up to her, hugging her leg. Thank you," he shouted, tears streaking his face. Emily crouched, eyes brimming. "You're welcome, you're all safe now." She could feel the enormity of her actions in these small moments. The lives saved, the panic soothed, the terror turned into relief. Medical teams began escorting some passengers to ambulances for checks, but most were coherent, clutching belongings, trying to process what had just happened. Emily walked slowly down the line, offering reassurances, small smiles, gentle nods. Every step reminded her that her hands, her decisions, her courage had been the thin line between life and death. Finally, a uniformed official approached. "Emily Carter," he said formally, "on behalf of the FAA and the airline, you've performed an act of unprecedented heroism. We will need statements, but more importantly, we want you to know the magnitude of what you've done." Emily nodded quietly, swallowing hard. Magnitude. It was impossible to comprehend fully. She had always seen herself as a flight attendant, a professional doing her job, helping passengers, guiding them safely through routine flights. Now she realized that in the span of less than 2 hours, she had become something extraordinary, someone who had held the power of life in her hands and emerged victorious. Behind her, emergency crews secured the aircraft, checking systems, noting damage, preparing reports. Emily glanced back at Flight 372, massive and imposing, a symbol of both terror and salvation. She had faced the worst the skis could throw at her and emerged as more than just a survivor. She was a guardian, a hero, a legend in the making. The first passenger to fully comprehend the enormity of the moment, an elderly woman approached Emily, trembling. "Young lady, I've flown for decades. Never have I seen courage like yours. You are an angel." Emily shook her head gently. "No, I'm just someone who didn't give up, that's all." She wanted to deflect praise, but the reality remained. She had done the impossible. As the last passengers were escorted to waiting buses, the buzz of media and airport personnel grew. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered questions. Emily's phone buzzed constantly with messages. News outlets, family, friends, strangers who had heard fragments of the story. Yet she ignored them. For her, the focus remained on the human element, the families she had helped keep alive. One mother clasped her hand, holding tears back. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Emily forced a small smile. "Live your lives, that's all the thanks I need." Finally, she allowed herself a moment to step away from the chaos, leaning against the rail of the jetway. Her uniform hung loose, sweat-drenched, hair messy from hours of stress and exertion. She let the adrenaline ebb, feeling exhaustion wash over her like a physical tide. Marcus came up beside her. "Do you realize what you've just done?" he asked softly. She looked out at the runway, golden in the evening light, the planes lined up, passengers moving safely, emergency crews packing away equipment. I think I'm starting to," she admitted quietly. "But it doesn't feel real yet. Maybe it never will." A news helicopter circled overhead, catching every movement. Emily glanced at it but didn't flinch. She had flown through terror, faced death, and emerged alive. Public attention felt secondary. Yet she knew that soon, the story would go viral, social media ablaze with praise, disbelief, and admiration. And then she would have to face it. The fame, the scrutiny, the narrative of a flight attendant turned hero, of a woman who had taken command when no one else could. It would be overwhelming, but she was ready. Or at least she told herself she was. Suddenly her phone buzzed. A message from the airline CEO. "Emily, on behalf of everyone at the company, thank you. You are a hero. We will honor you properly." Emily exhaled, a tear slipping down her cheek. She typed back, fingers shaking, "I just did what I had to do." The sun dipped lower, casting a fiery glow over the horizon. Flight 372 stood silent behind her, a monument to courage, fear, and the impossible. Emily Carter, once a flight attendant, had flown through chaos, taken command when the cockpit went silent, and saved 146 lives. She allowed herself a moment to reflect. The fear, the panic, the uncertainty, it had all been real. The terror of staring death in the eyes at 10,000 meters, knowing every life hung by a thread, she had faced it. And she had triumphed. Paramedics finally approached, urging her to sit and get checked. She allowed herself to lean back, breathing deeply. Marcus stood at her side, alert but relieved. Emergency crews moved efficiently around them. She had done it. They were alive. She was alive. The first wave of media approached. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Emily straightened, uniform wrinkled but posture strong. She had faced death at cruising altitude. Now she would face the world. A reporter's voice cut through the air. "Emily Carter, can you tell us what it felt like to land the plane alone?" Emily took a steadying breath. "It wasn't just me," she said firmly, voice calm despite exhaustion. "It was the crew, the passengers, and every person who trusted me. Courage is in all of us. It's not about being fearless. It's about acting when it matters most." Cameras clicked, microphones recorded. She had become the living embodiment of bravery, grace under pressure, and human resilience. As night fell, the passengers were safely escorted, the plane secured, and emergency crews departing. Emily Carter finally allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the weight of exhaustion, fear, and triumph mingling inside her. She had faced the unimaginable, stared into the abyss, and emerged victorious. The world would know her story soon. Headlines, videos, social media, it would all explode with praise and disbelief. Yet for Emily, the true reward was silent. 146 lives, hearts still beating, families intact. And somewhere in that quiet, in the midst of exhaustion and awe, Emily Carter realized something profound. Being a hero isn't about accolades or fame. It's about courage, determination, and refusing to give up when the world expects you to. Tonight, the skis had been unforgiving, but one woman had refused to surrender, and in doing so, had saved 146 lives. Emily turned toward the horizon, wind whipping her hair, lights of the runway fading behind her. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a pilot, a guardian, a hero, and the world